World War One ends, and there's so much happening in this section and so much important information because really we have, again, as I've mentioned in several other videos, the seeds of World War II are planted literally within events that happen in World War One. So there's a lot going on in this section. This will probably be like a 20-minute video for whoever's watching. But as the war continued to drag on in the West, nations began waging what historians would later call total war by basically recruiting and eventually drafting men to fight in the war. That excitement of 1914 has completely waned off, especially in the West, which is completely locked in stalemate, and all the nations were throwing their entire weight into the war, waging again total war. This was no summer war. This was no conflict that would be over really quickly. Gray's assessment was right. The lights of Europe are going out all over Europe, and we will not see them lit in our lifetimes. The British had a blockade in the North Sea that made it very, very difficult to get food into Austria-Hungary and Germany. These two countries would begin to have several famines. 1916 became known as the turnip winter. Everyone was forced to eat turnips as a main staple because the crops had actually failed that year. A combination of the weather, along with, again, blockade, unable to get food shipped into these countries. The United States is, again, still not in the conflict. It's continuing to sell arms to the United Kingdom and becoming quite prosperous. We saw that German U-boats patrolled parts of the West Atlantic trying to stop the supplies from getting into the UK. And in 1915, a German U-boat torpedoed the British liner the Lusitania off the coast of Ireland, which actually killed 1,200 passengers, 128 of whom were American. This is one of the major events that's going to push the United States into the conflict eventually in 1917. Propaganda becomes an aspect of the First World War. Total war meant for the controlling of opinions of all countries involved, meaning regardless of whether you were French, German, or British, leaders, again, these leaders who here they're negotiating the end of the war. In the Hall of Mirrors, I made the comparison. This is Louis XIV. I want to draw a connection between these two photographs in a second, if I can. But these leaders need to control the populations in order to make sure that they don't know exactly just how awful the conflict is. Censors limited the casualty rates, meaning after the Battle of Somme, for example, the newspapers weren't publishing how many British deaths had occurred because if the public knew, they might start to turn their back against the war. And the sheer number of casualties, though, just began to reveal themselves. Again, the Battle of the Somme, 1916, 60,000 British casualties on the first day. The public is beginning to recognize just how costly a war this conflict is waging. So how can we connect this to our world? The importance of diverse news reporting. News, not new. To ensure that we have a diversity of sources to tell us exactly what's happening. So again, before we can go on, I made the comparison. The Hall of Mirrors, the Palace of Versailles, I wrote down that 243 years have passed since the reign of Louis the 14th and his prime, and eventually the Treaty of Versailles. So how much power did these statesmen have compared to the Sun King? Again, we're looking for this idea of equality, of everybody's equal, but these World War I generals, as we'll see, are still just throwing soldiers across no man's land as they go over the top in an attempt to gain what? To gain a little bit of ground in a conflict that spiraled out of control. Women in the war, our text talks about it, and what changed for women in this conflict. As millions of men left factory jobs for the front, women stepped in to fill the void and to take on roles that they traditionally hadn't held before, working in factories to create munitions, vehicles, rubber for the vehicles, cloth for the soldiers. So they stepped into these factories. Nurses played huge roles on the front, especially after, as my dog makes a bunch of noise in the background, I still sound like a tin can. Big pushes where one side would go over the top and charge at an enemy trench. Nurse Vera Britton described a 90 degree in France where she after a push, was involved in stopping hemorrhaging, replacing intestines, and draining and reinserting innumerable rubber, I'm plugged in, I thought, innumerable tubes heaped upon the floor. Wow. Hold on, this is going to be a weird pause as I try to make sure that I have power for this video. Oh, it wasn't plugged in. Hopefully that didn't take too long. So, yeah, like we're seeing again with just this total war, the role that women are playing. And a growing sense of pride and confidence arose among women who were working in jobs and factories that they had never been involved in before. There was still a very much so domestic, tranquil life that women were expected to adhere to during World War I and before. And now, when more responsibility is placed upon their shoulders during this era of total war, there's this new sense of pride that they have. And when the war ended and the men came back taking the jobs that the women had held on to, there was this sense of there wasn't a domestic life that was not as fulfilling. It's almost like when you've had a chance to do something outside of the home for the first time, and it has value and it has importance and a sense of pride, and it's taken away, you have a sense of, well, I want that back. There's probably no coincidence that in Britain, Germany, and the United States, women would be granted the right to vote shortly after the war's conclusion. This is a photograph of a nurse being awarded after the Battle of Verdun in 1916. So who would break first in this conflict? By 1915, 16, and 17, it was anybody's guess because it was a stalemate everywhere. Germany was sending 15-year-old boys to the front. Great Britain was on the verge of bankruptcy. There were mutinies in France, and Italian soldiers deserted. Russian troops left. But Russia would be the first to drop out in 1917 when the Russian Revolution begins. And there will be another video to cover this story as well. The Tsar, Nicholas II, was ousted, and the Allies thought that Russia for a time would actually become a democratic country. But before all this happened, there was this idea about a new form of government, Marxism, that emerged with the writings of Karl Marx, later on adopted by Lenin. Then a second revolution brought Lenin to power, and this started in 1917, Russian Revolution, and then Lenin signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, I don't know how to pronounce that, I'm sorry, which Germany, but basically this brought Russia out of the war, meaning that Germany can focus exclusively on the Western Front. And we will see on the Western Front, it will begin to be really intense. Here's a poem, Suicide in the Trenches. This is a soldier writing about his general. You smug-faced crowds with the kindling eye, who cheer when soldiers lad march by, sneak home and pray you'll never know the hell where youth and laughter go. Again, there's this callous disregard for human life among the generals on all sides, really. The United States will eventually enter the war in 1917. What was happening on February 17th, Germany announced that it would engage in unrestricted submarine warfare, making U.S. shipment to the Allies more costly. So there's going to be unrestricted submarine warfare along this country, meaning that Germany would torpedo any ship, regardless of whether it was carrying weapons or not, into the UK, because these Allied shipments were really still propping up the Allies. Opinion is still actually divided in the United States as to which side they want to join, which again I think speaks to the ambiguity present in the First World War. Culturally and historically, the United States had language ties with the British. There were sympathies in France as it was attacked as a fellow democracy, the United States as a democracy and France as a democracy. But there were still many ethnic Germans that lived in the United States that supported the Central Powers, and Jewish Russian refugees didn't support the Tsars. So even though Russia backed out in 1917, it was still a part of the Allies from 1914 through 1917 when the revolution took place. So what event would eventually tip the United States into joining one side? Oh, also, and many Irish still didn't support assisting the British due to their repression and their long history. The event that triggered the United States entry into the war, though, was the Zimmermann Telegraph. In early 1917, the British intercepted a message from the German ambassador to Mexico, Arthur Zimmermann. The Zimmermann Telegraph read that if Mexico pledged to join the war and the Central Powers against the United States, Germany would help it to reacquire the territories of New Mexico, Texas, and Arizona along the United States' southern border. We have to remember that these territories were annexed after the Mexican-American War with very, very questionable terms. And Mexican-American War, going back to it, the United States annexed those territories that historically, we have to go back 2 phases, were a part of the Republic of Mexico, but were, of course, before that, Native American lands. Again, we're always fighting over lands, but again, these territories, questionable as to who it belongs to, if land really even belongs to anybody. But this was the final tipping point, and President Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war, and the United States entered onto the side of the Allies, famously noting that the world must be made safe for democracy, President Woodrow Wilson's quote, as we'll talk about in a second. But after the Zimmermann Telegraph, 2 million Americans were eventually sent to fight along the Western Front in Europe. An exhausted German offensive lost one final offensive, but it was eventually contained. There was a final counterattack, pushed the German army back. The Ottomans were collapsing in the south, and then it was clear that by 1918 the war would effectively be ended. It was negotiated that it would end on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918. Was when World War I would end. The costs were staggering. If we take a look down here at the casualty rate means either you are killed or you are wounded. The Russians suffered 76%, the British 36%, the French 73%, the United States 7%, which again, it was only really in it for less than a year, the Germans 65%, Austria-Hungary 90%. Meaning 9 out of 10 soldiers that enlisted in the Austro-Hungarian side were either killed or wounded. Total numbers killed. Every country, at least 1 million, with the British is almost to 1 million. French, United States again in 1 year. Germans, the Austro-Hungarians. The sheer number of forces mobilized, 12 million, 8 million, 8 million, 11 million, 7 million. Total casualties are just staggering, almost 10 million. For the Russians, almost 7 million for the Austro-Hungarians, and the financial costs of the war and what it meant. We will see and pay special attention to what it cost Germany to wage this war, and then what Germany would be expected to pay after the war are again the exact seeds that would lead to the Second World War. So President Woodrow Wilson, and I took a picture from the Oversimplified video. If you don't watch Oversimplified, you should. I think it's hilarious. He does a great job. But he will kind of see himself as a figure who can kind of try to unite everybody after the war. The United States, because it wasn't affected by the war greatly, becomes the world's largest economy and the world's largest power. So it's stepping onto the global stage and asserting itself. He has these famous 14 points. No more secret treaties, again, to ensure that everybody knows which side everybody's on. Freedom of the seas, free trade, reduction of arms, evacuation of territory in Russia, the return of Alsace-Lorraine to the French, more information about what should happen so that we don't have another war. Again, he's these famous 14 points. He issued it in January of 1918, before the war was over, which was an attempt to more or less end the First World War and all wars, as World War I will become known as the war to end all wars. And it also set the stage for Wilson's creation of the League of Nations, which would also ultimately fail. So what about political instability in the post-war era? What's happening now in the world after we've seen this just absolutely devastating conflict for 4 years, the largest war the world has ever seen? Well, the Spanish flu immediately afterwards killed an estimated 20 million people worldwide, which was an influenza, a pandemic that happened. Countries were absolutely wrecked economically, especially in Germany. This is Europe in 1920. The governments of the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and that of Germany all collapsed, so the borders were changed. And many radicals began calling for dramatic reforms in all of these countries. I put a picture of, this is the old high school gym at my high school where I teach right now. This is in like 1994. I think this is my dad actually, but I asked my students every year, my 7th and 8th graders, like, what always happens after your basketball team loses a close game? and they can usually arrive at the right answer. This is a bit of a tangent, but they'll say like, "Coach yells at us," and I was like, "Well, yeah, but something else happens. Um, we have to run sprints the next day." And I'm like, "Well, okay, then maybe something else happens." Um, Funny, they say like we sing on the way, we don't sing on the way home on the bus. And I was like, okay, but what else happens? And eventually they get to it, and the answer is, in these basketball games which take place after school, is it's always unanimous. After you lose, you always blame the refs, the referees. It was their fault. I get so frustrated with this because they're doing an impossible job. But like, after you lose, it can't possibly be your fault, right? Like, you trained, you practiced, you did your best. You want an excuse because in human nature we don't like to lose. Countries acting as individuals don't like to lose. So you find an excuse, you find a scapegoat, you blame. As we saw in the Ottoman Empire, it was blamed on the ethnic Christian Armenians. In post-World War Germany, the scapegoat whose fault it was that Germany lost this war that it very well could have won will be the Jewish bankers, the Jewish generals, the Jewish financiers who ensured that Germany would be defeated. This is happening all over the world too, not just in Germany. It happens in Italy. It will happen in Russia. It'll happen in other parts of the world. So there's something about this that I think is really revealing. Really interestingly, soldiers from Asia and Africa who were part of European colonies left feeling very pessimistic about European hegemony. I use the example. Liang Qichao was this Qing dynasty. Later on, he was an observer of European countries. He was one of the guys who said, "Okay, we have fallen drastically behind the West. We need to catch up from them. We need to learn from them. We need to understand how we can modernize our economies and change our culture so that we can compete with these Western nations." Because again, remember, China was under this century of humiliation, which was carved up by European powers. So there was this obsession, especially prior World War I. How can we learn from the Europeans? But all of a sudden, this is the Europeans. This is what we're supposed to learn. The advent of the Industrial Revolution led to this. Like, maybe we should be rethinking everything. And this is happening. I use him as an example. I read about him in a book, but like, it happens. Scholars from West Africa, like, there's this obsession with the West, but my God, this was terrible. And this will definitely desire for freedom from colonial rule was certainly heightened in the post-World War I era. The Treaty of Versailles is so critical to understand because it led to the Second World War. So learn from other sources too. This is just, I just teach world history 9th grade. This is my understanding of it, but this is just such an important topic that should be understood, especially by statesmen, especially by diplomats, so that the world can't repeat the excuses of the Second World War. The Allies met in Paris to discuss the peace agreement. Woodrow Wilson, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, was David Lloyd George. The leader of the French was George Clemenceau. I think I pronounced that correctly. They would decide on the future of former Ottoman Empire and various colonies around the world. The Ottoman Empire, again here, this territory will be demarcated famously by the Allied powers, thinking that they understand the realities of ethnic tribal groups, of cultural groups in the Far East. Borders will be drawn and changed. Representation was not present from Germany nor Russia. Russia was in the midst of its revolution at the time, becoming a communist country, a Marxist country. No representation was from there. Again, these three guys and the diplomats from the Allies are deciding the course of the post-World War I era. Wilson wanted to dominate the conversation also, too. He brings his 14 points. I think it was Clemenceau who famously said, "Oh, Jesus only had 10. Wilson has 14. My. David Lloyd George wanted a bolt to the British economy. Clemenceau wanted a weakened Germany so much that it could never again threaten France. I have this on the next slide. There was a desire to punish Germany as the sole party responsible for the First World War, or the main party responsible for the First World War. Historians always say it was complicated. It was a confusion of a cascade of events, but Germany was ultimately blamed. Clemenceau wanted Germany weakened so that it could never again threaten France. And the drawing of new territories from former empires like the Ottoman Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire caused many problems because different ethnic groups often overlapped with other ethnic groups desiring states of their own. Wilson will also propose a new model, something called the League of Nations, which would be introduced so that countries could work out their differences rather than spiraling towards disagreement. Other aspects of the treaty. We see, again, this is Europe 1920, and there are significant changes between the Europe of 1920 and the Europe of 1914. Poland became a nation. The Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia come into existence along Russia's border. Czechoslovakia becomes a nation, and Hungary and Austria were created from the former Austro-Hungarian Empire. So these states are all carved up, or all newly created as a result of the First World War. Yugoslavia also emerges in the Baltic states, but as we saw even before the war, when the Austro-Hungarian Empire existed, there's many different ethnic groups that didn't get along for a variety of reasons living in southeastern Europe and the Balkans too. But the most important aspect, I think, for world history is just the punitive effect that it had on Germany. In June 1919, German representatives received the news of the Treaty of Versailles. Germany was completely blamed for starting the war. War reparations are amounting to, in today's terms, $400 billion were owed to the Allies. Again, the attempt being to weaken Germany here so that it can never again threaten France. There was an attempt to just absolutely punish Germany. Germany didn't have this money. Germany couldn't pay this money back. And when the stock market collapses in 1939, don't start barking, Bruno, it will get even worse for Germany. Oh, not 1939. No, I'm sorry. That's 1929 when the stock market collapses. My bad. Germany was also forced to sign, but bitter contempt for the Treaty of Versailles would linger for the next 20 years, launching the world into the Second World War. So, again, punitive, I should have had that slide earlier, means to inflict or intending a harsh punishment. There was a lot of discontent with the treaty in other parts of the world too. Italy desired more territory. Japan was making more territorial gains in China that were not recognized in the West. Japan was starting to continue to carve up Manchuria, especially in the 1920s, late 20s, and then a railroad incident in really 1931 will set the stage for the Second World War. Russia resented this idea of Poland along its border, and we'll see in the Second World War, Germany and Russia will initially agree to partition Poland. And there was also discontent within the United States, which weakened the League too. Senator Henry Cabot Lodge protested the League's existence and eventually ensured that the United States would not even join the League that it created. So this place where all these countries are supposed to hash out their differences, the idea created by the United States, but then the United States didn't even ratify it. So we can see there's this clear discontent. And this is, again, seeds of the Second World War, created in the First World War and immediately after the First World War. So the theme, too, as we'll see in a later video, the response of the United States after World War I versus World War II will differ greatly, which is, again, I think, lessons about what should happen after conflicts. You want to strengthen your enemy. You don't want to weaken your enemy.